Okay, well, hello everyone. My name is Richard Albert, and I'm really pleased to have with us today John Baird, former Foreign Minister for Canada, among other things, and I'll go over the list of portfolios he's held. But first, I just want to welcome you to this first event of the year, sponsored by the Canadian Studies Committee. I'm here in the capacity of the Canadian Bicentennial Visiting Professorship, and it's wonderful to be back here. I was a student here many years ago. In fact, my advisor, my former advisor, David Cameron, is here on the Canadian Studies Committee, and he's been a very strong supporter of our events this year. We have many planned for you, and it's just a great way to start, John, to kick off our program. So thank you very, very much. Before we start, I want to say a few words of thanks to the people who've helped make this program possible. Jesse Boretsky has been wonderful, thank you. Omer Aziz, Rahima Chowdhury, Lena Chen, Whitney Dole, Lourdes Haynes, George Joseph, Ian Shapiro, and Marilyn Wilkes. A number of people have helped put this event together, and we're very grateful. So today, of course, John Baird is here. Many of you know John's past history. Let me just go over very briefly some of the things that John Baird has done over the course of his long career, but still quite young. It's remarkable the number of things that he's accomplished thus far. As you know, he's former foreign minister for Canada from 2011 to 2015. Before that, he held a number of portfolios: Environment Minister, President of the Treasury Board, Minister for Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, also the leader of the government in the House of Commons. And before joining federal politics, he was, of course, at Queen's Park, where he held a number of portfolios: Minister of Community and Social Services, Minister of Energy. He was also government House Leader. And now he's a senior business advisor at Bennett Jones in Toronto. So it's really lovely to have you here. I'll just say one more thing about John before we begin. We share one thing, many things in common, one of which is that we're both from the Ottawa area. John's an Ottawa native. He's a Golden Gale as well, a graduate of Queen's with a BA in political studies. We have a Queen's person here, it sounds like. No. A Queen's person right here, Omer Aziz.
I think if you're a Golden Gale, you're a football player. I was not a football player.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. And John, thank you for being here. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
So let's begin. I think the plan is I'll ask a few questions just to begin our conversation. Then we'll open it up over the course of the hour and 15 minutes to all of you to raise your questions. And please just introduce yourselves. Let us know where you're from, and we'll take it from there. But the first question, John, is you were foreign minister at a very important time, tumultuous time in the world. 2011, 2015. We saw Arab Spring, financial crisis, period of war, some movement toward peace. What would you say are some of the most memorable moments of your time as foreign minister? Maybe some of your greatest achievements, and also some of your regrets. Let's start with most memorable moments.
I think you just had the opportunity, every day on the job to meet some incredible people or see some people who are going through some incredible good and bad times. I can recall visiting the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan and just be blown away by the scale of the humanitarian crisis. Walking through a slum in Mumbai and seeing the depths of poverty that I had just never seen before. At the same time, you got to see some of the very best in people. I can recall the day I met Aung San Suu Kyi, and just someone of a remarkable human achievement and accomplishment. So you saw some of the very worst in the world, but some of the very best as well.
And what were some of the great victories you helped Canada get during your time as foreign minister?
I think my job was to promote Canadian values and to promote Canadian interests. There's never really a finish line when you're doing that. I think the conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership discussions today is a huge coup for the country. We're a trading country, and the more opportunities we have to compete on a level playing field, I think the better it'll be for our economy. I think when it comes to, we had a great initiative that the Prime Minister led on child and maternal health, where we've seen, literally billions of dollars of new investment come from the developed economies to improve the lives and to make a real difference for young women and their children. Human rights is something that's very important. We really, as Canadians, I think probably the biggest gift, lesson that we can impart on the world is pluralism. In Canada, people from all sorts of different backgrounds, different countries, cultures, religions can come together and live in relative peace and harmony. So whether it was promoting religious freedoms, promoting the rights of women, which has become a huge priority for Canada over the last number of years, and beginning to finally raise issues about the equality of sexual minorities around the world, and conversations that had never taken place. So those are some of the things.
Are we doing enough with the Syrian refugee crisis in Canada?
The scale of this crisis, I don't think anyone can come close to say they're doing enough. This is I mean, the scale of the refugee crisis, not just from Syria, but from Iraq and the region, is incredible. And whatever we're doing, we've got to do more. We've got to balance off, obviously, humanitarian efforts with security efforts. You know, I think where we can particularly play a role, or we have played a role, is helping religious minorities who are fleeing persecution. And then we look at, obviously, you know, the plight of the most vulnerable, you know, women and children. What we can do there, obviously, is important. I think certainly when I left government, we were in the top 5 countries in terms of providing, you know, committing and providing financial assistance to support the refugees. But whatever every country's doing, we've obviously got to do a lot more. I mean, obviously, you know, ending the crisis can be the single most important thing, so we don't see more people forced, you know, to risk their lives to flee.
One of the things that you championed as foreign minister are LGBT rights. How and why did this become a foreign policy priority for Canada under your leadership?
I think if you looked at the world, this is a conversation which just rarely takes place, and you know, maybe it's the fact that, you know, gays and lesbians enjoy the same rights and freedoms in Canada, by and large, that, you know, we can take that, impart our experience to other countries around the world, but it's just not acceptable in 2015 for, you know, new laws to be initiated, whether they're in Russia, whether they're in Uganda, whether they're in Nigeria. And these are issues which had never really been raised at a lot of international forums. And I think Canada, with the United States, particularly under Secretary Clinton, with the British government under David Cameron, are finally beginning to start to raise them. And you see the you know, horrific persecution that sexual minorities are facing at the hands of ISIL in Syria. And I just saw on Twitter last night, you know, 4 gays were, you know, literally thrown off a 6-story roof while a crowd cheered below. I mean, it's just appalling.
Take us inside the foreign policy making process. So you mentioned that this had not been something that Canada was involved in before you became foreign minister. So how do we go from no conversation to leading the world? How does that work?
Not about leading the world, but first and foremost, you've got the power of your country's voice to be able to speak up, whether it's at the General Assembly at the UN, whether it's at the Commonwealth, whether it's, you know, having difficult conversations bilaterally. These are just conversations which have never taken place in the past, and are just starting to take place. And Canada's been one of the few countries who's been prepared to raise them.
Let's begin to open up the floor to questions from the audience. I have more questions, but let's kick things off with questions from you, please. Just introduce yourself.
I'm Julian. I think what the Conservative government did with LGBT rights externally was fantastic and very needed, but I'm curious as to how you can compare that to what happened inside the country, where your party was responsible. If your party had been in power in 2005, Canada would still not have same-sex marriage right now.
I think the McMurtry decision in Ontario, which wasn't appealed by the previous government, it wasn't appealed by the provincial government in Ontario, it was a Court of Appeal decision, I think would have quickly led, you know, all 10 provinces and 3 territories. You know, I think most politicians have come a long way on this issue. Both Prime Minister Chrétien and Prime Minister Martin voted against gay marriage in, I believe, 1999 or 2000. President Obama and Secretary Clinton, when they campaigned for President 2008, were against it. I think people's views, by and large, have evolved, and it's just no longer an issue. Strangely, Stephen Harper's commitment to reopen the issue probably put the final nails in the coffin, because after the vote in December of 2006, which was a substantial majority, he was able to come out of the Parliament, come out of the House of Commons and say, listen, this is settled. We're not reopening it. And that was really the final nail in the coffin, and it really hasn't been an issue in Canadian politics since then. And I find it an extraordinary thing that in the United States, the biggest opposition to same-sex marriage is not a conservative politician running for president, but an obscure a county clerk in Kentucky. So it just shows you the monumental sea change of the melting of opposition, and that's a good thing. In Canada, it happened over a period of 20 years, whether it was the Human Rights Code in the 80s, whether it was the M versus H decision in Ontario in '99, or whether it was with the McMurtry decision. And Roy McMurtry was a former Conservative Attorney General in Ontario for 10 years before he served on the bench. But it's funny, in Canada, this is just no longer an issue.
Right. It seems like in 2005 when you guys were campaigning, that it was used to appeal to the basest instincts of your base, and and it didn't work.
I don't think a lot of parties can be proud of their record in the past. I can remember on the issue of same-sex spousal benefits, some of the most hateful and mean-spirited speeches were by New Democratic MPPs sitting in Bob Rae's caucus. The Liberal Party had promised, to support it and then didn't. So I think all three parties can't be particularly proud of their record. The good news is I think it's largely settled, and it's just not something that it literally disappeared from in the course of about 5 years. And I think in the United States, I think it was Newt Gingrich who said this is just like an iceberg that's melting in the hot summer sun. And the fact that President Obama, when he did a 180-degree change in his position, 6 months before his election, that it really wasn't a significant issue in that election was pretty telling. I think what we as well can do is, we're talking, the debates we have in Canada about marriage or spousal benefits are nothing when you talk about the criminalization and the death penalty that we see in parts of the world. And there are many countries with laws on the books that have been enforced for years, but when you see countries like in Nigeria or Uganda bringing in new laws, in the 21st century, that's just not acceptable. And this is starting to come up. The United States has done a lot, particularly when Hillary started out, and the British government is doing a lot too.
John, let's move to TPP, which you mentioned just a moment ago. What are the implications of the TPP on the Canadian election, which is ongoing right now?
We'll see. This is a huge and consequential, trade agreement. It rewrites NAFTA, so it's a modernization of the U.S. and Mexican relationship in terms of trade. We already have trade agreements with Peru and Chile, but it also gives us trade agreements with Vietnam, with Brunei, with Singapore, with Australia, New Zealand. Most importantly, though, with Japan, the world's third largest economy. I think this tries to, in the absence of success in the Doha round, this sets the pace for what the framework of a global deal either will be or will evolve to, particularly in a part of the world in the Asia-Pacific region, which I think needs it. So I think it's positive. I think it's a good thing. I think the Democrats have traditionally not been supportive of trade deals. Liberals have been, less enthusiastic about them. So I think it'll be an interesting, day and 2 weeks, and then when the next Parliament reconvenes, whatever happens, we'll see.
Let me ask you a question that I think many of the people in the room are wondering or have wondered, which is, why did you decide to resign when you did? Here you are at the height of your career as a political actor in Canada, at the height of your power and influence, and you decide to step away.
I think it's nice to go when you're on top of your game. I spent 10 years in Ontario politics, 10 years in federal politics. I had 10 different cabinet jobs. I had a great run. Just decided that it was that I wouldn't seek a 7th term. And I think sometimes people stay too long in jobs. And I mean, there's a few other people who have had 10 cabinet posts. I had a great run, and I thought foreign affairs was a great way to cap off a career and to do other things. I think that's good.
We might see you again.
I don't know about that. It's the only business where you leave, you retire, and people immediately wonder when you're coming back.
Questions? Yes, Omer.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So I have a two-part question. Actually, two questions, one less contentious, one more contentious. So I'll start with the less contentious one first.
Then I'll cut you off and we'll go to the next question.
Yeah, so I believe when you were foreign minister, it was when you were foreign minister, Canada closed our embassy in Iran, and that seemed to have been, I'm actually not sure what motivated it. I believe it was in September or October of 2012. So what motivated that decision, especially considering that 3 years later now, the world powers led by the United States and even with Russia and China have signed a nuclear agreement with Iran? So that's the first question. The second question is, we've seen in the domestic political scene, the niqab has become an issue in the Canadian election. Now, I'm not someone who thinks that this is something people should wear, but I recognize that in a free society, women should be left, the choice should be left to the individual to decide whether they should wear that or not. And your former boss, Prime Minister Harper, has made it a point to tout his anti-niqab position and to appeal the federal court decision to the Supreme Court, one woman's decision to wear a niqab during a ceremony, even though she agreed that she would turn her face and take the oath of citizenship if there was a woman there and reveal her face. And I wanted to get your comment on that, considering that you've been a defender of religious minorities elsewhere around the world, and I think that we need to stay consistent and be supporting religious minorities in our own country as well.
Sure. I believe people are free to make their own decisions to wear a niqab or not. That's an individual freedom which people should be entitled to. I guess it speaks to the kind of Canada that we want for the future, and I think there's a real and significant concern about the subjugation of women. And I was Minister of Transport. We had to deal with this issue. Will we have, both at the airport screening and at the gate? Would we have to have a private room for people to be able to show their face? Would we have to ensure that we had a woman and a man on duty at all times to be able to deal with that? And I think it's when you're, there's some instances, taking the oath, or when you're boarding an airline, when you're getting a picture taken for your driver's license, where you'll be required to show your face, to validate your identity. And beyond that, people are free to do what they want in a free and open society. With respect to Iran, the biggest issue was the security, the safety and security of our men and women at our Canadian embassy. That was not a secure embassy. There was no setback from the street. So the diplomats that decried what we had done, I don't know where they were over the last 20 years ensuring we had a safe embassy for our folks. We watched closely what happened with the British when their embassy was stormed. Parliament had passed legislation requiring me as Minister of Foreign Affairs to designate state sponsors of terror. And the deadline was the end of September 2012, and I felt very uncomfortable designating Iran as a state sponsor of terror and then leaving our staff vulnerable in the center of Tehran. So we made the difficult decision to close it. We hadn't had an ambassador there for many years. The relationship was dealing with very low-level officials, and frankly, we hadn't accomplished much since the death of Zahra Kazemi, the photojournalist, and then the cover-up of the details of that. So, we made a difficult decision, and I stand by it. It was the right thing to do. Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terror in the world. They've got the blood on their hands for literally thousands. Well, they got the blood on their hands in the deaths of thousands of people in Syria. They support directly the government supporting groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and others. Their abysmal and deteriorating human rights record under Rouhani. More people have been put to death since Rouhani came to power. And then, of course, their nuclear program. One of the cornerstones of Canadian foreign policy is nuclear non-proliferation, and I fear we're, notwithstanding the agreement, I fear we're on the wrong path. And the one thing I can say, with the exception of the government of Assad, Canada's views on Iran are the exact same as every other country in the region, in the Middle East. Whether it's Israel, whether it's the Emirates, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Jordan, there's real concerns there.
John, let me ask you a question about Canada's standing in the world. How would you say Canada's standing in the world today compares to where it was in the past? Has there been a decline? Is it better in your view? Where are we today?
I think different governments have different philosophies on how they conduct policies. I think by and large the Canadian foreign policy is there's been a radical shift. I think if there were people who preferred the previous government's foreign policy, their friends around the world would not agree with our foreign policy, nor would they agree with our economic policy, nor would they agree with other policies we've taken. I think by and large around the world, Canada enjoys good relations. If you look at the public opinion polling that Jim Zogby does, he's a big American pollster, he's head of the American Arab Institute. He's done public opinion polling in just about every Arab country, and Canada is consistently at or near the top in terms of people's perceptions of us. I think as far as Canada's influence in the world, I think we have a world that's much more decentralized. It's not all about the G7, it's the G20. It's not all about the power of the United States and the West versus the communist world. You have a lot of emerging. China has a lot more power than it had years ago. Countries like Mexico have a lot more power. Countries like Indonesia have a lot more power. So you've seen that power is just much more diffuse. And I think with 35 million people, we punch above our weight. But in a world of 7 billion, we have so much more power. India, I could speak about Korea, I could speak about South Africa, Nigeria. So power is much more diffuse. But I think I put a lot of time, for example, a lot of the world's hotspots are in the Middle East. And we have a fantastic relationship with just about every Arab country. We have first time ever we've have a representative to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. We have good relations in the Gulf, good relations in North Africa. Whether you go to Cairo, Riyadh, or Abu Dhabi, Oman, it's pretty good. In the ASEAN countries, we put a huge new focus in Southeast Asia, not just in China and India, but in the ASEAN countries where it's very positive. In South America, we've done a lot.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Michael. I'm an undergrad from Toronto. Canada has an incredibly diverse and very large immigrant population, and this means that there's a lot of personal contact between Canadians and family members living abroad. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the opportunities and complications that this presents when executing a foreign policy.
It's an opportunity, obviously, on issues like trade and relations that I think that no government has been able to fully exploit, which I think is a bad thing. We've got to do a better job of harnessing that. I think that you will have certain immigrant communities with very strong views for or against various regimes at home. Whether it's you look at the population, the immigrants we've had from Sri Lanka. Obviously, Canadian Tamils are politically active and have strong views. If you look at the immigrant communities from China, some are from Taiwan, some are from Hong Kong, some are pro-regime, some are sympathetic to the Falun Gong. It's all over the map. I think at the end of the day, we should take decisions which are principled decisions in the best interest of the country. Obviously, it is informed by experiences that as a country as a whole that we have. I think my party is the only center-right party that I can think of in the world who wins the immigrant vote. So we're doing something different than a lot of other parties who are center-left. You go into some Conservative Party events, and there are no white Anglo-Saxon people in some communities. And I'll tell you, that was incredibly different than it was 30 years ago when I first got involved in politics, where if you had a vowel at the end of your name, that was rare. But we have new immigrant communities that are incredibly politically active. You look at the number of South Asian members of Parliament we have in all parties. It's huge, significant. That's one example. I think that's a good thing, that the Parliament increasingly looks like the new face of Canada. By and large, that's a welcoming thing. I think the single biggest example we can set is the pluralism that Canada has built up, which is a great example for the rest of the world. Too often, you see particularly religious cleavages be huge destabilizing effects in other parts of the world. You know, when you look at the Coptic Christians in Egypt, when you look at Christians in Iraq, which have been, you know, dwindling. If you look at the persecution of Ahmadiyya Muslims in Iran, you look at I mean, there's all kinds of examples. We set up an Office of Religious Freedom, which is really seeking to promote, you know, pluralism around the world, and done a lot of work with His Highness the Aga Khan. We certainly need to do more with you know, like-minded folks.
Hi, my name's Abby. I'm a law student in Toronto. Just on this question of pluralism, one of the big critiques of the Harvard government is they've done more to differentiate between citizens than any other government in Canadian history. Thinking of three prominent examples. One is this new move to try to restrict Canadians abroad from voting. The second being ushering in a Bill C-24, which actually relocates the authority for revoking citizenship from the courts to a partisan elected official, being the Minister of Immigration. And the third being sort of this part and parcel of the what people have called rising anti-immigrant sentiment. You look at Stephen Harper and the debates differentiating between old stock Canadians and immigrant Canadians. So I want to know sort of broadly what you make of that critique, whether you agree with
Sure.
it, and maybe
I don't know what was in the Prime Minister's heart when he talked about old stock Canadians, but I can tell you this: our government is a very, very pro-immigration government. We brought in more immigrants than any government in Canadian history. We've resettled, you know, more refugees per capita than any other country in the world, and we're doing more, not less, than we did before. I think the fact that we win the immigrant vote, you know, speaks volumes. The candidate running to replace me in Parliament is someone who came to this country at age 13. He served as a police officer for 12 years, worked at the RCMP for 2. You know, he's a black Somali Muslim Canadian. And, you know, I endorsed him for the nomination. He got great support in our party. So I guess I just don't share, that conclusion. You know, we revoke people's citizenship if they're war criminals. So if people have dual nationality, it's not something I have a problem with. With respect to, what was the other issue? Oh, the voting. You know, listen, I just, if you don't live in Canada, you don't pay taxes in Canada, I just don't have a problem with people not being able to vote. If you're a Canadian citizen, you're not and you live abroad, you're not entitled to health care. You're not entitled to, receive social programs. And so if there's a Canadian who's never set foot in Canada, I just think them having the ability to set taxation rates and set the laws with which we all live under is just not the appropriate way to go. You know, others can fairly disagree. That's a reasonable difference of opinion. That's my views. I suspect it's probably the overwhelming view in Canada.
Whom do you admire, John? Either in politics or out of politics?
Oh. I have a lot. This will surprise people. I have a lot of regard for Hillary Clinton. She's smart. She's tough. The Aga Khan is someone who I have huge regard for. Incredible guy. You know, strangely, his views are very Canadian-esque in terms of pluralism. We've supported the International Center for Pluralism in Ottawa. He's got his new museum and art gallery in Toronto, which is fantastic. I just had the chance to work with some really amazing people, and you can see the very best in the human spirit, and you can see also the very worst. You know, someone like Putin, you know, the very worst, someone who's just evil. I mean, people say we have a frozen conflict in Ukraine. Well, it's not a frozen conflict. We have people die every day. We see him now indiscriminately targeting areas where ISIS has never been present in Syria. I mean, he's given material and moral support that has allowed Assad to to carry on, and that's resulted in the biggest humanitarian crisis and given birth to ISIS.
Yes, Julian.
Talk about giving ISIS or Assad material support and how horrendous and evil Putin is, but your government wasn't afraid to make a $15 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia, who have horrendous human rights issues in their country, including right now. I think he was 17-year-old when he was arrested at a protest, and he's going to be crucified.
Sure. I supported that deal. I was there when it was signed. I signed off on it personally. I support it. I don't want to see the Islamic State, who wants to create a caliphate, to be able to march into Saudi Arabia to try to take Mecca and Medina. I think it's in our interests that the kingdom can maintain its borders. I think we also have in that region Iran, which is materially trying to intervene in just about every single country in the region, and I don't think that it's in anyone's interest that they expand their sphere of influence into Saudi Arabia. I feel really strongly about that. That hasn't said this will create a lot of jobs in Canada. It doesn't mean, though, that it's always a choice between our values and our interests. I can tell you, I spent 45 minutes with now King Salman last fall and had a long conversation with him about human rights. I visited the Human Rights Commission in Riyadh, long discussions with respect to what Saudi Arabia should do, particularly about with the equality of men and women in their society. And I think we can use the relationship that we have to raise these issues, which we do. Obviously we don't share a lot of the values that they do in Saudi Arabia, but I think we're better to engage than not engage.
What guarantees do you have that they're not going to use those against their own people?
Light armored vehicles. I mean, I haven't seen them have to use much military power. I just don't think we'd want to see them their borders porous and wide open to ISIS or to Iran's. Iran is now has troops in Iraq, has troops in Syria. They're directly arming the Houthis. They're occupying 1 or 2 islands that belong to the Emirates. I just don't think it's in our interests that they be able to expand their influence any farther. We're at war right now, and Saudi Arabia also has done air missions in Syria. You have to find the world you have to take the world as you find it, not as you wish it would be. We worked with some pretty nefarious characters in other times of our history, which I don't think are as bad. But listen, it's not an either or. We can do both. But I should say that I strongly support the deal. And I'll tell you this: we didn't get any questions in Parliament when we brought it through. Those auto workers are represented by Unifor Union, and the NDP didn't get up and ask a single question in Parliament. So I think there was a consensus that it was the right thing to do. I see now we're in an election campaign, and people voices were a little bit louder, but they were far more timid when the deal was first signed. But I'll say this: listen, regional people can differ. That's my opinion. Regional people can differ, and you try to tackle the issues as best you can. It rarely, though, you find one that's you can hit both the values and the interests at the same time. But I want to tell you, though, we do have good discussions on human rights, as people would expect us to have at the most senior levels. What I believe, particularly in that part of the world, if we can do one single thing, it's the role that women play in that type of society. Whether it's women in peace and security, whether it's women being involved in government and civil society, the more women that are involved, the better that society is going to be. You look at the United Arab Emirates, which is not a liberal democracy. They have a woman ambassador at the UN. They have a woman commerce minister. And you look at the Freedom Index that exists in the Emirates. It's a great example for the rest of the region.
What is the state of the Canada-U.S. relationship? And here, I guess I want to ask about Keystone and whether that tells us anything about where the relationship is.
I think the relationship, by and large, is good. Keystone has obviously been a problem. Listen, we've had problems. I mean, the previous government had a big issue with softwood lumber. Prime Minister Mulroney had big fights with Reagan on South Africa and on sanctions with apartheid. We had big issues on acid rain until we finally resolved them near the end of President Reagan's time in office. So Keystone is bad. I strongly support it. I think the Americans should, but that shouldn't be the whole relationship. I mean, obviously, we have been, when the president, things like the trust fund for Afghanistan, when he called, Canada was there. In the fight against the Islamic State, we're the only Western country bombing in Syria as well as in Iraq. We're doing training on the ground with the Kurds. So I think we're a reliable friend and ally of the United States. I just take exceptional issue with the time and the delays on Keystone. I'll try to find a way to forgive Hillary for her position. In Canada, of course, we never take strong political decisions during an election campaign for political reasons. We would never do that, of course, in Canada.
Omer, yes.
Do you want to first? Yeah, okay, I actually wanted to follow up on the Saudi Arabia question because you mentioned ISIS and you mentioned Iran, and look, no one's going to defend Iran's human rights record because it's indefensible, but I hear irony in your statement when you talk about ISIS, because ISIS and Saudi Arabia are exactly part of the same coin. In fact, they're on the same side of the same coin. Their ideology is exactly the same in terms of the punishments that they give to people, in terms of the degrading treatment of human beings, especially women, in terms of the treatment of religious minorities. They're bombing Yemen right now where 30 people are dying every single day. There's been 5,000 people who have died already. 80% of that country is malnourished. They've beheaded over 100 people this year. They're going to set a record for beheadings and crucifixions this year. They're the exact same as ISIS. And so I share your human rights concerns, criticisms, but I'm sorry, I hear hypocrisy when I say that, when you say that you defend a deal where we're selling these guys $15 billion. It would be like selling ISIS $15 billion.
I just don't share that view. I just don't share that view. I mean, you look at the effort in Yemen, you clearly have Iran trying to expand its sphere of influence. And I can understand why they're not prepared to sit back and allow that to happen. Iranian expansionist motives and wanting to have political hegemony in the region is, I think, just bad for everyone. I don't support the death penalty. I think it's wrong, particularly the way it's carried out in the kingdom. And we can have that conversation. I don't think, though. I just don't accept the notion that Saudi Arabia and ISIS are synonymous. I just don't.
You don't find it a little bit problematic that we sold this regime $15 billion in
No, I signed off on the deal. I supported it.
Yeah.
And not one single member of Parliament, not one NDP member of Parliament got up and complained about it. Not one Liberal member of Parliament stood up and asked me a tough question about it. So I guess you could say their silence was acceptance. Listen, there's many issues which are problematic there. We have good conversations with them, but I think we got to be clear. We don't want. ISIL's desire to establish a caliphate. I mean, they would have to take Mecca and Medina to realize that vision. I think it would be a disaster for the entire planet if they did it. And we'll play a small commercial role in that.
Domestic, political, and economic interest then that motivated it, because it clearly wasn't.
But I clearly outlined my views on the foreign policy implications of it, which I led with.
Yeah.
But listen, I appreciate reasonable people can disagree. They should elect a member of Parliament who would ask a question, which they didn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Liberal NDP moral hypocrisy doesn't excuse Conservative moral hypocrisy.
I'm just saying is you have to make difficult decisions. You can't pick and choose the ones you have to confront. But I signed it and I support it, and I'm quite comfortable defending it.
Yeah, I guess I just expected more for a party that claims to defend human rights, because this is one of the worst human rights abusers in the world. Second, probably North Korea.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that. But
Well, we'll come back
fair
to the
point
region.
to object.
We'll come back to the region because I want to ask you about Israel. But first, I want to ask you, John, to go back to when you were the age of many of the students here in the room. Let's
Probably
say,
a minister at that age.
well, let's say between 19, 23 or thereabouts, because you got into politics at 25, 26. What were you thinking at that time that you wanted to do with your life?
I always wanted to be a member of provincial parliament and a provincial minister. Those are the only two really political goals that I had. I happened to meet Stephen Harper when I was a teenager and helped him out in 2003, 2004 when he was running for the leadership of the party. And when he lost an election, I expected him to win. I thought some people have to get off the bench and into the game to see us establish first a credible opposition, which I think every democracy should have, and then obviously an alternative government.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so you reached both of those goals at a very young age. By 31, is that right?
Yep.
You had been elected to the provincial parliament and been a cabinet minister.
I think when I got to Ottawa, I just didn't have anything to prove because I felt just comfortable with my skin. And when in politics, I think you regret things you don't do rather than things you did. And when I had a chance, we left government in 2003, and I predicted we'd probably be out for 8 years. And then when you could get back into government in 2 years, it was just such an incredible opportunity to try to make a difference. I think you were probably more comfortable making decisions, more comfortable tackling problems, more comfortable with risk.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
I wanted to ask a little bit about something that came up when you were talking about the Keystone Pipeline in terms of Canada's role in environmental movements around the world that you probably touched on in foreign affairs and in your time in the environment. What are your kind of thoughts on Canada's role as tackling issues like climate change?
I think more than anything is we need a comprehensive agreement from all large emitters for real reductions. I think regardless, it just doesn't, if someone's putting a fire hose in the bathtub, it just doesn't really make much sense to be bailing out. And when we have countries like China who won't even agree to a common reporting standard, let alone a common verification standard, it's just very problematic. And if we're just exporting our emissions to foreign countries, we won't be accomplishing anything. And I think we should almost take a Hippocratic oath at first, do no damage to the environment. I'll use an example. British Columbia has a carbon tax. They're seen as very progressive and heralded by a lot of environmentalists. Well, you just simply don't buy your cement, fabricate cement in British Columbia, you just buy it from China, where the clinker process is more carbon intensive, and then you have all the emissions from the transport of it. So let's get all the big emitters on board, and then I think real action can happen. I think we continue to just have the same conversation over and over and over again, and we never seem to get a deal that will deliver that.
But we've seen China and the U.S. making some progress. Where's Canada?
What progress have been made?
Well, at least there's discussions about having some sort of agreement. Sure. I agree that the progress has been not as much as we would have liked to see.
But have they gone forward 1 inch?
I would think so.
But in China, which is now the world's largest emitter, they haven't committed to reduce their carbon emissions by a single ton for 15 years. They haven't committed to even stop growing their carbon emissions for the next 15 years. I have a lot of friends in China. I admire the Chinese. They haven't even agreed on the same reporting standard between Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries. So, I mean, great photo op and great announcement of it. But I asked a senior American friend in the Obama administration, with this Canada-China deal, will emissions be higher among the world's 2 largest emitters in 15 years, or will they be lower? And they couldn't answer. So I think science is tremendously important in this discussion, but I think mathematics is just as important. And whatever we commit to doing, let's have the clear math and to present it. I'll give you an example. The provincial government of Ontario has closed 5 coal-fired generating stations. I opposed that at the time. I said you couldn't do it by 2007 when they promised. An all-party legislative committee came forward and said you could do it by 2015. They did. I think they closed the last one in 2013 or 2014. But there you have real reductions in carbon. You can actually measure it. It's not like being sold to offset credits somewhere else. It's less carbon in the planet. We need more efforts that are going to be real and tangible, and less that's a shell game. And we really haven't accomplished anything. If we close our 5 coal-fired generating stations, and then they open up 5 in a year in China, and we've got to remember this is a global problem. Some people will make the case, let's lead. Well, in Ontario, our electricity prices have gone through the roof. We're importing electricity from the United States, where there's, two Detroit Edison plants and so across the bridge in southwestern Ontario, which pump out a lot of emissions. So let's just my view is let's get all the big players. No one is expecting like an Ethiopia or Jamaica to come to the table, but any country who's got $1.75 trillion of foreign currency reserves, I think, could certainly agree to common reporting standards. And I feel really strongly about that. I do fear the politics of this. I read an exchange between David Suzuki and Justin Trudeau, where Trudeau called him a sanctimonious ass, and David Suzuki called him a twerp.
I agree.
Welcome to my hell. I'd like to see us take real action, but meaningful action that's consequential.
Yes, please.
Again,
Your name, please?
Sorry, Emily. I'm not Canadian, but I did my undergrad in Montreal, so I like the whole Canadian politics thing. I feel like if I simplify, and maybe you'll be opposed to my simplification, but if I simplify your last argument a bit, it would sound like if we don't get all the world players on board with the environmental challenges that we're facing, then there's no point in doing anything at home. And I feel like when you look at the tar sands, it's a very local environmental issue. So isn't there a point in doing something at home, even though we can't get everybody on board?
Listen, the goal is to reduce emissions. If we take actions to reduce emissions, and people who we do trade with, China's our second largest trading partner, increases emission, we won't have accomplished the objective. So let's look at mathematics and ensure that if we're going to take the action, it's going to cost us economically, that we get a benefit from it.
What do you make of the tar sands impact on Canada's environment specifically?
We've gotten rid of the previous government, brought in big tax subsidies for them, the accelerated capital cost deduction, we got rid of it. I'm one who strongly believes in new technologies. The previous government in Alberta put in a carbon levy. There's a tech fund sitting there with a lot of money in it, which hasn't been deployed, which should be. I don't think the oil companies are actually getting the squeeze to deploy that technology to the extent that they should. Let's give the new government in Alberta an opportunity. One thing I don't support is transferring wealth, from Alberta to other provinces. If there's money paid into a tech fund in Alberta, let's let it be deployed in Alberta, with the oil sands, or whether it's the chemical industry. I support regulating large final emitters, but what I don't want to do is to simply say, what we did in British Columbia is, put a carbon tax on cement and then just import it from China, because you'll make cement more expensive, and the environment will get worse, not better. So that's my view. I use the example if you had a big rowboat. If someone put a fire hose to fill it up with water, I'm going to stop bailing because it won't have not just much effect. You're still going to be going down. And we continue to have this debate. And I tell you, the speech that I gave at the Bali summit of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was quite controversial. The EU that's their policy today. That is, Antonio Barroso, the former president of the European Union, before he left, gave a speech that was virtually word for word what I said back in 2007. And we've just got to tackle that to get the big players participating, or we'll take significant action. There'll be significant costs, and there'll be not just no effect, but it'll actually get worse. Others have a different view. It's a very challenging file.
Yes.
So we talked a little bit about Syria in our discussion. I know we're going to take a look at another issue later on sort of the Israel side of the Middle East situation. But I just wanted to ask one further question. Just given the change and the evolution of the Syria situation in the last week with Russian intervention, I was just wondering if maybe your thoughts on what we should be doing with an older policy in the Syrian situation, which is sort of the Kurds and our support for the Kurds, military and political, and whether the government should be doing more, but especially in light of sort of escalating tensions in Turkey, political tensions in Turkey involving the Kurds, and now the Russian situation in Syria.
I think the Kurds have been great friends to Canada. We're doing a training mission in Erbil because I think we're comfortable with training the Kurds. I know the U.S. has done training with some of the more reasonable elements in Syria. That has been less effective. In some respects, what we're seeing is that there was no pluralism in the government in Erbil, in Baghdad, and you saw the country begin to fragment between Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish, and that's a problem. We've gone from in Syria worrying about would the opposition respect pluralism to, would they slaughter minorities if it's not.
Moved away from the West in its domestic political situation and has not necessarily aligned itself with the views of other NATO allies, especially now with the Kurdish situation.
Yeah, but obviously, the government in Ankara has taken a different stand that was the vision of Ataturk. I like the idea of NATO or NATO member countries working with regional partners. You look at the United Arab Emirates. In my adult lifetime, I think we've taken kinetic action 6 times, and all 6 times we've done it with the Emiratis. I think that's a good thing. I think Jordanians are good partners in the fight against ISIL, for example. I think it's important. I think we saw in Afghanistan is that there was a lot of NATO countries who were prepared to be active in Afghanistan, but they just didn't want their soldiers to leave base. And they put a lot of covenants on their participation, and that was a disappointment, I think, not just to the United States, but to the future of the alliance. I think we look at Russia's incursion into Crimea and then eastern Ukraine. There's a wide variety of views in NATO, and I mean, Ukraine is not a NATO member country, but we've got to stand firm. It's just not acceptable for one country to try to redraw the borders of Europe through unilateral military action in the 21st century. I think if anything, Canada's relationship with NATO is probably growing stronger, and our relationship with Eastern Europe is growing stronger.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I'm from Canada, but I work down here at University of New York. And I'm interested in your declaration of Canada's government's dedication to human rights and what you think about the sort of major human rights organizations in the world condemning Canada's record of human rights, specifically, most recently in the summer, the UN Human Rights Commission issued a report that, sort of reiterates what Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch has been saying about Canada's sort of ongoing genocidal practices against Indigenous people, but specifically Canada's reluctance to, not Harper government's reluctance to enter into an inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada.
Listen,
I just want to put in there also the condemnation of the grave concern that the UN has about the Indigenous women in Canada and this kind of wide-reaching Bill C-51 kind of anti-terrorism bill.
Sure. Listen, I'll take, I'll invite anyone in the free world to come and look at the human rights that Canadians enjoy, and in the history of human civilization, I think there's precious few places in the world where human rights are so widely respected in practice and in principle. With the issue of Indigenous women, I think this is more an elite-based policy discussion than a more practical one. I just think spending $50 million on a royal commission or an inquiry where a lot of lawyers would get rich simply is just not an effective way to tackle the problem. I think there is a lot of violence in Aboriginal communities. That's a problem. I think when Aboriginal women go missing in urban areas, I think, let's be frank, if these were 6-year-old blonde-haired children from upper middle class families, they would get a lot more attention because we don't value, our society hasn't given value to every life, and I think we need to, and that's not a code word for pro-life because I'm pro-choice, but there are concrete measures we've got to take. There still is a tremendous amount of racism in some parts of the country. I went into in northern British Columbia to a Tim Hortons coffee shop, and it astounded me because I grew up in Ottawa and I've just never seen this. All the Aboriginals were on one side of the coffee shop, and all of the Caucasians were in the other. That just astounded me because I had never seen anything like that in Canada. So I think there's got to be just more we can do to tackle. The Aboriginal questions of Canada have been a challenge for our government, just as they were with the previous governments. There's no easy solutions.
I saw a hand up here. Yes.
Josh from Edmonton, med student. Just a quick question. Do you find that military strength for a smaller power like Canada is still like an important factor in determining how much influence we wield abroad?
Certainly, folks at NATO like to tell us that. We only spend about 0.9% of our GDP on military, where in the NATO we're supposed to be committed for 2%. I'd like to see us spend more. Having said that, on just about all of these missions, we're prepared to do the heavy lifting where no one else will. You know, we took, after the United Kingdom and Britain, the United Kingdom and the United States, we took more casualties per capita than any other country in the world in Afghanistan after 9/11. You know, when it came to the campaign in Libya, we had a Canadian lead it. We were the only country not to put up a red card every morning saying we would bomb here or not bomb there. So we're prepared to do our share of the heavy lifting when it's required. Obviously, we can do more. It's just a question of money. There's only so much money you've got, and a lot of competing interests. Healthcare and education, obviously, the #1 priority of the average Canadian, and that's where our money, that's where the taxpayers' money goes. And we've increased since Stephen Harper became Prime Minister. The healthcare budget, federal transfers have gone up by 6% every single year. Post-secondary education by 3% every single year. And that's it's number 2 priorities of Canadians, but number 1 and number 2 priorities of Canadians. But at some point, there's going to be a taxation department and a health department in our country, and that's unsustainable. Healthcare is really important, but so too is the environment, so too is policing, so too is one of the jobs I have now is I'm an advisor to the Ontario Association for Community Living. People don't think of helping people with an intellectual disability as a big priority when you ask public opinion pollsters. But there are people with voices which aren't as loud, and we need to keep their interests in mind as well.
I want to ask about transparency in government, because this has been a recurring critique of the Harper government that since it's come into power in 2006, that there's been sort of a clampdown and increase in secrecy so that individual citizens don't have the access to information that they need, especially in the digital age when things should be more transparent. So I'm thinking about things like the elimination of the National Science Advisor. I'm thinking about the muzzling of Environment Canada scientists, where we've seen press reports about climate change go down 80%. I'm talking about things like the Fair Election Act, where the Chief Electoral Officer was told that he could not even promote the act of voting. You would think that in 2015 you would want more people to come out to the polls, considering that we've had historic lows. The elimination of the long-form census, again, was criticized by left and by right members on the right. And I have to ask, like, what motivates this? I mean, apart from the result that we know that people are going to have less information and they're going to be voting or not voting based on less information, which might favor one party over the other. But you would think that a government that came into power based on liberal corruption in 2006 would be more committed to transparency and open government, and yet we've seen trends completely in the opposite.
Well, I mean, threw out a bunch of them. I'll answer 2 of them. One, we just didn't think threatening to put people in jail if they didn't fill out their long-form census was a bit extreme in the 21st century. I'll use the other example about Elections Canada deciding where to promote voting. I had a group come into my constituency office and they said, don't we want to see the highest percentage of Canadians come out and vote? I said, absolutely. And I said, what do you think about Elections Canada targeting university campuses to get young people out to vote for the first time? Oh, that would be a great thing, Mr. Baird. Great. They're going to put special polling stations on university campuses to get young people out to vote. Well, that's a great idea, Mr. Baird. Well, great. What if I had someone come in from the local Catholic Women's League saying, let's put voting booths at churches on Sunday mornings, and then we can get more Christian evangelicals and Roman Catholics out to vote. Wouldn't that be great? Well, I don't think I like that, Mr. Baird. So I just think when you have Elections Canada decide which demographic they're going to promote to get out and vote, it can be hugely consequential to elections, and it shouldn't be, it shouldn't be a government bureaucrat making that decision.
Shouldn't it be a government bureaucrat making that decision rather than?
What sort of values are they going to come to play in terms of how they use that power? I'll use the example. There's a church near my home. There's 3,000 people that go there every Sunday. Could we hold a special advance poll there? He would probably get an extra 500 people out to vote. Now, I can tell you, I'm for gay marriage and I'm pro-choice. I'm not sure I want them doing that.
Yeah, it seems as though if Election Canada wanted to target certain
But
communities.
what I'm saying is that gives their values would come into play in making those type of decisions. And I have a real problem with that.
You target universities because there's disparate populations there from all over the place.
And they don't
have
vote.
a home base to vote from. That's not good.
I'm just saying is that you could say you could go to a large evangelical church and you could get more people to vote.
But that's got nothing to do with what I just said.
Well, I'm saying is I don't like a government bureaucrat making those type of decisions. You can agree, people can agree, or
It's just crass.
disagree with that. Well, that's people can disagree.
Do you have a number on how many people went to jail because they didn't fill out their on-call census?
I just think threatening. I didn't say put them in jail.
Yeah.
I said threatening to put them in jail.
So I'm almost certain about this, and maybe someone can Google
Listen,
it.
we were a minority government when that happened. We survived another 2.5 years after it, so it couldn't have been that bad because the government enjoyed the confidence of the House from the opposition for another 2 years.
Let me ask a question. I'm interested in details, and I'd love to know about a day in the life of a foreign minister. So, are you checking your BlackBerry in bed in the morning?
Yes.
Tell me about a day.
There is no day.
There's no, of course,
You're
common
traveling
day,
half
but
the
tell me.
time. You're traveling half the time. You're dealing with bilateral relations. You're dealing with the big problems in the world. And when you're in Canada, you're disproportionately doing writing stuff, doing your house duty that you've missed, and the other half the time you're away, welcoming foreign visitors. When you're abroad, you're dealing with, like, whether it's the Syria problem, the Libya problem, the Commonwealth problem. So there's just no day that's the same.
What's your biggest or maybe one regret that you have from your 4 years as foreign minister?
I look back and there's always things that, I wish we could have done more here. I wish we could have done more there. But I mean, you're always going to have, you've only got 24 hours in a day and you're not able to do everything you wanted. One of the things I got on to in my second half of my time at Foreign Affairs is how can we exploit social media and the internet to promote political freedoms. We have a big project we're doing with the monk school in Iran, which is really exciting, giving a democratic space for people to participate in. So I got onto that sort of in the second half of my time.
When we were walking over here, you had some very nice things to say about Jean Chrétien. I wasn't necessarily surprised, but I found myself nodding because he did a lot of great things for Canada's Prime Minister, and you seem to echo those views.
I think politics is the only business where you say nice things about people behind their backs. I don't agree with a lot of what Jean Chrétien did, but I think overall he was a good Prime Minister. He tackled tackling the huge fiscal mess the country faced was a pretty big accomplishment. I think everyone looked at the time that was at Paul Martin's success, and I think more and more people now look at the leadership had to come from the top.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I enjoy reading every so often is rankings of prime ministers. You see these things published. Michael Bliss has a ranking. Who do you think are some of Canada's greatest prime ministers? And of course, we'll exclude the current occupant, just to avoid the conflict there that may present.
I think you think of those people who fought big battles or those people who had great accomplishment. I mean, obviously MacDonald was huge in terms of the formation of the country. You look at the consequence that Laurier had on promoting the concept of free trade, on bringing the West into the country, huge. Mulroney is a very consequential prime minister in terms of tax reform, in terms of free trade, in terms of Canada's role in the world, whether in the Commonwealth, the fight against apartheid, things like that, pretty consequential.
Just one over here. I'll come back to you in a moment. Yes.
Dr. Model, currently an ND student here at Yale, but also foreign service officer at the Department of Foreign Affairs. Just wanted to address the issue of, pose a question to you related to the formulation and development of Canada's foreign policy, the center of influence in Ottawa, where it actually takes place. There's a prevailing feeling among Canadian diplomats that that center has shifted. I mean, during your time in office, the center of where the foreign policy is formulated has shifted from Sussex, 125 Sussex, where the Department of Foreign Affairs is located, to PCO and PMO. Was that a deliberate choice of your party, or was it simply a personal style of leadership or primary?
I think that's not unique to foreign policy. I think you've seen that certainly in my lifetime over the last 45 years, a huge growth in the size, not just of the PMO, but in the size of the Privy Council office. I mean, the number of people they have working on foreign defense and security policy at the Privy Council office is huge. And I often asked political actors when they would leave my office to go and work in the PMO, or a public servant who would leave the Department of Foreign Affairs to go work at PCO, which moment did they know it all? Was it the moment that they got the halfway point between the two buildings, or was it when they went through the archway in the Langevin block? From time to time, I'd have problems with that.
Do you feel that perhaps
and it's just as bad or worse at the bureaucratic level, by the way, than it is at the political level. I remember I was at a briefing on a particular issue in my first month or two on the job, and I said, well, okay, well, what has our ambassador said? You know, the woman who's on the ground in that country, leading our mission and in charge of our relationship with that country. Oh, they hadn't thought to ask her. And that just astounded me. So it's even we have it at Foreign Affairs between Pearson and the field. And there's no excuse for that with all the tech. You know, we don't have to send cables anymore. We can get live on, you can get live video connections and have literally the ambassador sit at the table. And too often they don't do that. They think they know all the best in the Pearson building when, trust me, the person who would probably be better able to tell you what's going on the ground in Cairo is our ambassador who's sitting on the ground there. The same would be the case in Kyiv, the same would be the case in Abuja, or I mean, you name it. So it's just as bad, I think it's just as even bad, even among the officials at Pearson, in my experience. And, at the end of the day, we live in a democracy. At the end of the day, elected officials make decisions. I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
Question on remaining on the domestic politics. What do you make of the Quebec question? I think as a foreigner studying in Montreal, I think quite a few of us were quite surprised to see how much of an issue it still was, because the perception from abroad is very much that, after that whole independence census, it quieted down and that now it's very much integrated. And I think there's a sense in Quebec, in certain parts of Quebec, a very deep sense of, or yearning for more independence, and of a reluctance to communicate or integrate with the rest of Canada, and it sometimes even goes to the level of a hatred towards English-speaking Canadians. And I also see a bit of an indifference coming from the English-speaking population for whom this is not necessarily an issue. So I don't personally have an opinion on it. I'm just curious as to whether you think that it will become more and more integrated in the future, and whether these issues will kind of quiet down.
I'm not predicting that Quebec is going to become more integrated in Canada. I can say that support for separation is lowest in my lifetime. In every public opinion poll. I mean, Philip Couillard, who's is the best premier in Canada, really crushed the PQ in the last election. The Bloc, a dissolution was on 2 seats. I think few predict, they have a chance of picking up more than a handful, if that. So I think the support for separation or sovereignty is probably at its lowest. I do worry about is the attachment to Canada of the average Quebecer isn't what I'd like to see it. But we don't have these, heated battles with Quebec anymore. Even frankly, when Pauline Marois was in government, I was told how terrible it was going to be, and we're going to be at war every day. And actually, the relationship, at least from a foreign perspective, was quite professional. Like, I worked well with her Minister of International Issues. I worked well with her personally. Obviously, I much prefer Charest or Couillard as premier, but I think by and large it's much better than it was. Prime Minister Chrétien was also on the front lines in the 82 question, so I think he probably got the blood boiling a little bit more than other leaders, either Martin or Harper, for example.
Let me ask you a question about the Senate of Canada. What do you make of what's happened to the Senate and what could be its future?
I'm one who either needs a major reform or it should be abolished. It's just, people say, well, these senators are not accountable. Well, that's the whole, it was all designed so they wouldn't be accountable. You know, when you have a job for life, it's, you know, you never have to knock on another door or, you know, meet a constituent. It's, no, the strange thing is we'd be the only, you know, big country in the world with a unicameral system. So I don't know what the answer is. But I mean, I think one of the things you do every day when you get up is you want to move the ball forward. You want to be able to accomplish something. And when it comes to Senate reform, I think you're just sort of taking your head and pounding it against a brick wall. Because it's a challenge to fix.
And it can't be fixed alone. All right. There'll be other things that have to come with it if you ever have negotiations among all the premiers. And
again, you've got 24 hours in the day. Says, well, why haven't you addressed this problem? Well, you know, maybe you tried and it just, you looked at your watch and you say, I want to move, you know, if I can't move this ball forward, even though it's an important ball, I'm going to get up every day and push the balls forward that are where I can get somewhere.
Let me go back to Israel, because I wanted to ask you about Israel. Has the relationship between Canada and Israel evolved over the past 15 years? There's a sense that, as you've said, there's a very strong relationship between Canada and Israel. I don't think people were saying this under the previous government. And if that's true, then what explains the new relationship?
I just think we're strong supporters of the State of Israel. It's the only liberal democracy in the region. I think terrorism is a great struggle of our generation, and far too often Israelis and Jews around the world are on the front lines of that struggle, and that's why we become a strong and vocal supporter of the State of Israel as a Jewish state. It's become a political consensus in Canada. Trudeau is campaigning, saying that there's no light between him and the government on foreign policy with respect to Israel. And Tom Mulcair has been very supportive of the government's position. I don't think I got a single question in question period in 4 years about our positions, because it's become virtually a consensus. And you'll see the odd NDPer will go off on a tangent, but that's about it.
Mm-hmm. Can you be seen as an honest broker? Can Canada be seen as an honest broker?
We're not an honest broker.
Not at all.
We're not a referee in the world. That's the traditional Canadian foreign policy. In World War I and World War II, we were in on day one. We didn't try to, we have strong values and we work with like-minded people. And I think there was a construct in the late 50s and 60s and 70s of this is Canada, well, we're peacekeepers. When we came to power, we were ranking 31 in the world for the number of peacekeepers. So I mean, the previous government got out of the peacekeeping business. That's no change with this government. But it hasn't prevented us. I mean, I've had an excellent relationship. I had an excellent relationship with President Abbas, the Palestinian foreign minister, came to Ottawa, stood beside me in front of the media, called me his friend. We have great relations in the Arab world, arguably better today than they've ever been.
Yes, one more over here, and then Omer.
Follow up on the situation in Syria and the refugee stuff. In particular, the situation of refugees. Do you think Canada can do more? No, you said that Canada could do more. In your mind, what could we do?
Yeah, I think we can balance off security interests with humanitarian capacity. I think Canadians want their government to be, as a people, we want to be generous and do our share. Whether we take 10,000 or 100,000, we've got to stop the war over there and bring peace. It's not a substitute, but that's not an excuse for not doing anything. We've provided a lot of financial resources. I think we're either 5th or 6th in terms of not just committed support, but delivering support. particularly in Jordan, where the government there has just been overwhelmed by the scale of it. I see, you know, I mean, obviously we don't want people die in these rafts going from Turkey to Greece, so we want to obviously stop those flows. But I think, yeah, I think Canada can do its share, and I think, you know, we want to be a compassionate people, and we've done a lot of in the region, bring persecuted religious minorities from Iraq, gays from Iran. I look at what Canada did with the Vietnamese Boat people. I mean, you know, it was a compassionate thing to do at the time, but it's actually been good for the country because they're great, you know, they've been great citizens. I think it's become very political and very charged in an election campaign.
Well, Mayor, we'll give you the last question, but just let me ask one question first. Canada's role in Haiti, could you talk a bit about that over the years? There seems to be a very close connection between the two.
We've made it a huge political priority, not just for development assistance, but in terms of political relations, in terms of trade. It's just the challenges that country faces in terms of, I mean, strangely, as a conservative, the biggest challenge I got is just a functioning bureaucracy. Things like a land title system, things like just the basic things to, you know, to make an electricity grid work, they've lacked. They've also had huge political problems with Congress, playing a very unconstructive role with the president. The infighting has been terrible. I thought Prime Minister Lamont was a decent guy, beginning to accomplish things, and he was turfed out. I don't know whether it was the president or Congress or both, but that's disappointing. It's challenging, and we've, like I said, I think it's either our first or our second, depending on the year, source of development assistance. But the challenges that country faces are just so incredible, and you know, it's their elected representatives as a group have failed the country in my judgment. And I'm not pointing fingers at any one individual, but President Clinton is the UN Special Representative. I think he's done a decent job, but it's just the problems are of such great magnitude.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mayor.
Does Canada still support a two-state solution in the Middle East?
Absolutely.
If so what did you do when you were in office to help bring diplomacy back?
Sure. We strongly support a two-state solution. I think the only way that's going to come about is if the two parties themselves sit down and make meaningful compromises. I've had long discussions with Bibi. I've had long discussions with President Abbas about this. I mean, there's a reason why this is the most intractable problem in the world. I think if the parties themselves continue to take the same approach to things, they're likely not to meet with success. I think the biggest thing in the interim before an agreement is reached is the PA's got to have the capacity to govern. We've made great development assistance investments there, particularly in the area of security. We work with the United States, provide a lot of money for courthouses, for training of the security officers, and the American and Canadian generals who work on this give the PA pretty good marks for the capacity that they've built. They've still got a huge way to go, but they've come a long way. We've done a lot investments in the last 2 years on economic development, because I think until people have food in their, you know, food on their plate and a job, the atmosphere for peace isn't going to be as strong as it needs to be. And that supplements a peace process. Doesn't replace it. I think a lot of politicians have been burned. You know, Ehud Barak is a friend of mine. I mean, he virtually offered the farm at Camp David in December 2000, and he asked Arafat, still said no. I look at Bibi. He appointed Zippy Livni to be his chief negotiator when he formed his third government. She's a dove. She's someone who the Palestinians like and admire and respect. And President Abbas appointed Saeb Erekat. He's an asshole. The Palestinian leadership themselves will tell you that. And I don't know how you're going to make peace with someone who's so angry and so bitter. This is not the big issue in the Middle East that Canadians and people in the West think it is. In Israel, this was barely an issue in their elections. In the Arab world, it rarely comes up, at least in my discussions. what you need is you need two strong leaders who are going to be prepared to make meaningful concessions that will hurt them and bite them at home. And I just don't think we've seen that. And you see one side when they're more ready to do it, the other side isn't. Strangely, I think President Clinton's framework was a pretty good one in Camp David. That's the basis of an agreement, I think, what it'll come down to. Some people more sympathetic to the Palestinian side say that Yasser Arafat, if he had gone home with the December 2000 agreement, he would have been assassinated. Well, I think we need leaders who are going to take bold moves. Prime Minister Rabin made a big move for peace. By signing the accord and establishing the PA up. President Sadat made it a remarkable man of peace. He paid a heavy price as well. This is what we need. We need great leaders. And the dynamic there isn't good. I mean, they constantly each other, Israeli expanding settlements, the incitement that comes directly from the PA is terrible. And the thing that disappoints me most is when you see young Palestinians growing up with a hatred of Israelis in their curricula and the school textbooks. Surely that's something we can agree with. I've had conversations with President Abbas about this on incitement. What could we do? Unfortunately, it didn't really get anywhere. They need strong leadership in the PA. Prime Minister Salam Fayyad is a great leader, fantastic guy. I think he was the person to provide it, but they made it so difficult for him. They pushed him out. I can remember John Kerry calling me and saying, "You have a good relationship with Fayyad. Can you get on the phone and encourage him not to resign?" I don't think anyone would have expected a Canadian foreign minister, let alone such a pro-Israeli like me, wanting to do that and having the kind of relationship where I could. But there's a reason why this is the most tractable problem in the world. And I think we've got to stop trying to think we can impose a solution from Washington. It's going to have to come from their two hearts. And one of the more disappointing things, I'm disappointed when they expand settlements. I think it's not just the expansion, but it sends a message that there's no future. But when President Abbas was asked, the refugee camp in Syria, Palestinian refugee camp in Syria, which had been there for 66 years, was coming under attack from some of the rebels who didn't share a pluralist vision. President Abbas was saying, would he take some refugees, Palestinian refugees from Syria to the West Bank? He said, absolutely not. That was very, the type of leadership that's problematic.
Well, before we clap and thank John Baird, one last question. What happens on October 19th?
His was the last question.
Well, I can improvise. What happens on October 19th, the Canadian federal election?
The person with the most seats will form a government. No, this is a very strange one. Trudeau came in with such low expectations, but he's campaigned well. Mulcair, who I quite like and I think is a smart guy, he's campaigning to the right of the Liberals. The Liberals have gone to the left, and the NDP, I think, is the centrist party. He's been very risk averse. He's trying to, deal with any of the traditional problems that traditional NDP parties have. But he's been too risk averse, and I think it's hurt him. Trudeau has taken more risks, like saying he's run a deficit. That's really challenging the fundamental consensus of Canadian politics for a while, for at least a generation. I think obviously Harper's running on more of the same. His base is just rock solid. He's within the margin of error on the same poll the entire election. We'll see. I would not be surprised. We saw two elections, one in British Columbia with Christy Clark getting elected, and one when Alison Redford was elected. And no one thought there was a hope in hell of either of them getting elected, like at 8 o'clock when the polls closed, and they both were majority governments. And I'm not predicting a majority government, but There's still 2 weeks to go. A lot can happen. Trudeau had a big rally last night. It looked like a winner. The TPP has been thrown in this morning. This could galvanize the NDP in Mulcair. It could be a real spike for the Conservatives. I mean, who knows? I mean, I mean, the good news is that we have a competitive election, and that's a good thing. I mean, you know, it's a vibrant democracy. It's funny because no one predicted that it would be going in this direction at least 2 weeks out. So we'll see what happens. I am just astounded that, you know, after 10 years, my party's still in the hunt. You know, because we're so out of the game for, you know, 3 elections. We weren't even, you know, credible alternatives, let alone being within the margin of error of winning. So that's an incredible thing. We didn't have an alternative government in this country for more than 10 years. I think that's very unhealthy for any democracy. So at least we've made it healthier.
Well, thank you so much, John Baird, for your time today. It's been
Thank you.
lovely to have you here.